"Est-ce Claire Morgan?" the woman said with a gentle smile before I had spoken a single word. "I was beginning to think you'd never come." My hand froze around the handle of my suitcase. The little brass bell above the bookstore door was still ringing behind me, but suddenly it sounded impossibly far away. I stared at the stranger standing behind the old wooden counter, searching her face for some flicker of recognition I should have felt. There was none. I had never seen her before in my life. At least I was almost certain I hadn't. The bookstore smelled of cedar shelves, worn paper, and cinnamon tea, the kind of scent that made people linger even when they had nowhere to be. Outside, the October rain tapped softly against the front windows, blurring the quiet streets of Cedar Hollow into watercolor streaks of gray and gold. I had driven nearly 600 miles to disappear into a town where nobody knew me. Somehow, before I even introduced myself, someone did. "I'm sorry," I finally managed. "Have we met?" She tilted her head ever so slightly, her auburn hair catching the warm afternoon light spilling through the skylight. Her green eyes held mine with a calmness that should have felt unsettling, yet somehow didn't. "No," she answered. "Not officially." She stepped around the counter and offered her hand.
"I'm Evelyn Harper."
Her handshake was warm, steady, familiar in a way I couldn't explain. "Welcome home." Home. The word landed harder than it should have. I had signed my divorce papers only 3 weeks earlier. 22 years of marriage had ended with 2 signatures, a quiet courthouse, and an awkward silence that neither my ex-husband nor I knew how to fill. I had spent the following days packing boxes, selling furniture, and convincing everyone, including myself, that starting over at 49 was brave instead of terrifying. Cedar Hollow had been nothing more than a dot on a map, chosen almost at random because it was far enough away from every memory I wanted to leave behind. "You must have me confused with someone else," I said softly. My fingers hovered above the envelope as if touching it too quickly might make everything disappear. The bookstore had become impossibly quiet. Even the rain outside seemed to soften, leaving only the faint creak of old wooden shelves settling with age. My mother's handwriting curved across the paper with the same elegant loops I had watched her write on birthday cards, lunch notes, and Christmas gifts when I was a little girl. I had not seen those familiar letters in 15 years. I looked up at Evelyn, searching for the answer that refused to come. "Where did you get this?" My voice barely sounded like mine. Evelyn folded her hands together. "I think you should read it when you are ready." "That is not an answer." She nodded gently. "I know." There was no defensiveness in her expression, only patience. Somehow that made the silence between us even more unsettling. I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket without opening it. I was not ready for my mother's words to exist again. "Not yet. Someone had to tell you my name," I said. "The moving company? My realtor." Evelyn smiled almost apologetically. "No." "Then how?" Before she could answer, the bell above the front door chimed again. An elderly couple stepped inside carrying dripping umbrellas. The woman noticed me immediately and offered a warm smile. "Well," she said to her husband, "she is finally here." My stomach tightened. The husband simply tipped his cap toward me as though we had known each other for years. "Good afternoon, Miss Morgan." They continued toward the history section without another word. I turned back to Evelyn so quickly that my shoulder brushed a stack of travel books. "What is happening?" I whispered. "Why does everyone know who I am?" Evelyn carefully straightened the books before meeting my eyes again. "Not everyone. Enough people." She let out a quiet breath. "Cedar Hollow is a small town. Stories stay here longer than people do." I wanted to demand another explanation, but none came. Instead, she walked toward a small table beside the front window where a steaming mug waited. "Chamomile," she said. "You look like someone who forgot to breathe." I almost laughed despite myself. "You assume a lot." "Not usually." I accepted the mug more out of politeness than trust. The warmth settled into my hands, chasing away the chill. Darkness settled over the bookstore for only a heartbeat before a row of small amber emergency lights flickered to life along the baseboards. Their soft glow transformed the shelves into long shadows that stretched across the polished wooden floor. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows with steady determination. Somewhere farther down the street, I heard the low hum of a backup generator coming alive, But this old building remained wrapped in quiet. The elderly couple barely reacted. The husband simply reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a tiny flashlight, and continued browsing as though power outages were part of the afternoon routine. Evelyn disappeared behind the counter and returned carrying 2 battery-powered lanterns. She placed one beside me, the warm light catching tiny flecks of dust floating lazily through the air. "Storms move in quickly this time of year," she said. "The power usually comes back within an hour." I nodded, still distracted by the envelope resting safely inside my coat. Every few seconds I felt the impossible urge to take it out, to tear it open, to hear my mother's voice one more time through words she had written long before she left this world. Just as quickly, fear pushed the thought away. Some memories were easier to carry unopened. My phone buzzed again. This time the screen remained dark. No signal. I frowned and walked toward the front window, lifting the device as though another inch might somehow reconnect me to the outside world. Nothing. "The cell tower north of town loses service during heavy storms," Evelyn explained before I even asked. "Sometimes for the entire evening." I let out a slow breath. Apparently I picked the perfect day to start over. "Or the exact day you were supposed to arrive." I looked back at her. There it was again. Another sentence that sounded simple until I tried to understand it. Before I could respond, the front door opened with surprising force as a gust of cool wind swept rainwater across the entrance. A young delivery driver stepped inside carrying 2 cardboard boxes wrapped in plastic. "Power is out all over downtown," he announced cheerfully. "Road by the bridge is already flooding. Sheriff says nobody should be driving tonight." Evelyn thanked him and signed the receipt while I stared through the glass at the darkening street. The rain had become so heavy that the buildings across the road were fading behind a silver curtain. Driving to the cottage suddenly felt far less appealing than it had 10 minutes earlier. The delivery driver hurried back outside, disappearing into the downpour almost instantly. Evelyn quietly locked the front door after him. "Just until the worst passes," she said. "People tend to wander in looking for shelter." She carried one of the boxes toward a small reading room near the back of the store. I hesitated before following. The room felt unexpectedly cozy with oversized armchairs, quilts folded neatly over their backs, and a stone fireplace that had clearly seen many winters. Evelyn knelt beside the hearth and struck a wooden match. Within moments, orange flames began dancing across stacked logs, filling the room with gentle warmth and the comforting scent of cedar smoke. "You planned for this," I observed. She smiled while adjusting the fire. "Living in a small coastal town teaches you that weather always gets the final vote." Thunder rolled again, softer this time, almost distant. Rain traced shimmering paths down the tall windows while the fire reflected across the glass like another hidden room. I wrapped my hands around the now lukewarm mug of tea and realized something that surprised me. For the first time since signing the divorce papers, I was not thinking about everything I had lost. I was thinking about why a woman I had never met seemed to be waiting for me long before I knew I was coming. The fire settled into a steady rhythm, each crackle blending with the rain that continued to wash over Cedar Hollow. Time seemed strangely different inside the bookstore. My watch insisted only 20 minutes had passed since the lights went out, but it felt as though I had stepped into another life entirely. Evelyn disappeared briefly through a narrow doorway and returned carrying a folded quilt. "The temperature always drops once the storm settles in," she said, placing it over the back of the chair beside me without making a fuss about it. "You will probably need this before the night is over." I smiled politely. "You seem very good at knowing what people need." She laughed softly. "Only after making plenty of mistakes." It was the first answer she had given that sounded completely ordinary, and somehow I appreciated it more than all the mysterious ones. The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful. I wandered toward one of the bookshelves while she organized a stack of returned novels. Every shelf seemed lovingly arranged, not by category alone but by emotion. Handwritten cards rested beneath certain books with simple notes like "For difficult goodbyes," "When you need courage," or stories that remind you to begin again. My fingertips brushed the worn spine of a novel I had once owned years ago. I had donated my copy after the divorce because every page reminded me of vacations that no longer belonged to me. "That one changed my life," Evelyn said without looking up. "Mine too," I admitted before I could stop myself. She smiled as though she had expected that answer. Some books find us more than once. I pulled the novel from the shelf. A faded library card slipped onto the floor. I bent to pick it up, but Evelyn reached it first. For a brief second our hands nearly touched. We both paused, then quietly laughed at the awkward timing. She handed me the card instead. Looks like it wanted your attention. The card listed dozens of names dating back more than 30 years. Near the bottom, one signature caught my eye. Margaret Morgan. My mother. My pulse stumbled. I looked up so quickly that the room seemed to tilt. She borrowed this? I whispered. Evelyn nodded. Several times. She lived here. Another small pause. For a while. My mind raced through every conversation I had ever had with my mother. She had spoken about childhood summers, college, my father, Ohio, but never once had she mentioned Cedar Hollow. Never this bookstore. Never Evelyn. Why would she keep something like this from me? I asked, though I was not sure whether I expected Evelyn to answer or the room itself. Evelyn folded another blanket with slow, careful movements. Sometimes people protect the chapters they never finished. Her words lingered in the warm air between us. Outside, the rain finally began to ease, leaving only the occasional drip from the porch roof. I glanced toward the front window, hoping to see clear streets, but instead I found flashing amber lights reflecting across the wet pavement. A sheriff's truck rolled slowly past the bookstore before stopping near the corner. An officer stepped out, spoke briefly with someone outside another shop, then continued down the block. Evelyn walked to the window beside me. The bridge is closed, she said quietly. Nobody will be leaving town tonight. I should have felt frustrated. Instead, I noticed something unexpected settling inside me. For the first time in months, there was nowhere else I believed I was supposed to be. As I looked out across the rain-soaked street, Evelyn gently placed another steaming mug of tea beside me without asking what I wanted. I looked at the cup, then at her. How did you know I would choose tea instead of coffee? She met my eyes with that same calm expression from the moment we first met. Because, she said almost in a whisper, your mother always did. The words settled over me more heavily than the storm clouds outside. I looked down at the steam rising from the cup between my hands, trying to convince myself there had to be a perfectly ordinary explanation. Maybe my mother had once passed through Cedar Hollow during college. Maybe she had spent a single summer here and simply forgotten to mention it. But nothing about this place felt accidental anymore. The library card, the envelope, the familiar handwriting, the strangers greeting me as though I had merely been away instead of arriving for the first time. You knew my mother well, did not you? I asked quietly. Evelyn did not answer right away. She stepped toward the fireplace and gently adjusted one of the burning logs before sitting across from me. The fire painted warm amber light across her face, softening every thoughtful expression. I knew the version of her that lived here, she finally said. People change as they move through life. The woman you knew and the woman I knew were both real. I let those words settle before asking the question that had been pressing against my chest since I walked through the bookstore door. Why did she never tell me about any of this? Evelyn looked toward the rain streaking across the window. Perhaps she hoped one day you would discover it for yourself. I almost laughed. That sounds like something from one of these novels. Life usually borrows from stories, not the other way around. I shook my head, smiling despite my confusion. You always answer questions by creating new ones. I know. Her smile carried the faintest hint of apology. I am trying not to take away a journey that belongs to you. The room fell quiet again. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It felt like the kind shared between people who trusted that words would arrive when they were ready. My eyes wandered toward an old black upright piano standing near the back wall. A framed photograph rested on top of it. I stood and walked closer, drawn by something I could not explain. The picture showed a group of smiling women gathered outside the bookstore many years earlier. Their clothes suggested the late 1980s. Some held coffee mugs. Others balanced stacks of books in their arms. Near the center stood a younger Evelyn, unmistakable despite the years. Beside her was another woman whose face had faded with time, but whose smile stopped me cold. My mother. She looked almost exactly as I remembered her from childhood photographs, her blonde hair lifted by the coastal breeze, one hand resting lightly on Evelyn's shoulder. "That was taken during our annual Autumn Book Festival," Evelyn said softly from behind me. "Your mother insisted everyone wear sweaters even though it was nearly 70 degrees. I found myself smiling through eyes that suddenly felt warm. She always carried a sweater, even in spring. She said weather could change faster than people. I laughed quietly. She really said that. For the first time since entering the bookstore, the mystery gave way to something gentler. Recognition. Not my own but my mother's. I could almost hear her laugh echoing between the shelves. My fingers reached toward the edge of the photograph without touching the glass. "I miss her," I admitted before I realized the words had escaped. Evelyn stepped beside me, leaving enough space that neither of us felt crowded. "I know." There was no attempt to comfort me with empty promises. No reminder that time heals everything. She simply stood there, allowing the sadness to exist without trying to fix it. Unexpectedly, that quiet understanding unraveled something inside me. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath scented with cedar, tea, and old books. When I opened them again, I noticed something tucked into the corner of the photograph's wooden frame. It was a folded piece of yellowed paper, barely visible behind the glass. My name was written across it in the same graceful handwriting as the unopened envelope resting inside my coat pocket. My heartbeat slowed until I could hear nothing except the quiet crackle of the fire and the rain dripping from the bookstore roof. I leaned closer to the photograph, convinced my eyes had to be playing tricks on me. The folded paper was tucked so carefully into the corner of the frame that it almost disappeared beneath the faded matting. My name was unmistakable. Claire Morgan. The same graceful handwriting. The same gentle curves I had traced on birthday cards as a child. "Did you know this was here?" I asked without taking my eyes off the frame. Evelyn nodded once. "Yes. Why did you not tell me?" "Because you never looked at the photograph until now." I turned toward her, almost frustrated by another answer that seemed too simple. Then I realized she was right. She had not pointed me toward the picture. She had allowed me to find it myself. Somehow that mattered. "May I?" I asked, gesturing toward the frame. "Of course." Evelyn carefully lifted it from the piano and opened the back with practiced hands. She slid the folded note free and placed it gently into my palm. It weighed almost nothing, yet my hands trembled as though I were holding something precious enough to change my life. I unfolded the paper slowly. The ink had faded slightly, but every word remained perfectly readable. "Claire, if you ever stand in this bookstore, it means life carried you farther than either of us expected. Do not be frightened by the feeling that some places remember you before you remember them. There are people who enter your life by chance, and there are people who quietly begin loving your future long before you arrive. Trust the second kind." I read the note twice before I realized tears had blurred the final sentence. There was no date, no explanation, only my mother's signature beneath the last line. "Margaret." I swallowed hard, unable to speak. Evelyn waited beside me without interrupting the silence. She seemed to understand that some moments belonged only to memory. "She wrote this for me?" I finally whispered. "She hoped one day you would read it," Evelyn answered softly. "She asked me to keep it safe." "When?" Evelyn looked into the fire for a long moment. "Many years ago." I folded the note carefully and slipped it back into its crease. Questions crowded my mind faster than I could ask them. Why had my mother trusted Evelyn with something so personal? Why had she believed I would one day come here? Most of all, why had she never spoken a single word about Cedar Hollow while she was alive? Before I could ask another question, the old grandfather clock near the staircase chimed 7 slow notes. The storm outside had softened into a light mist, but darkness had settled across the town. Evelyn glanced toward the front window. "The sheriff will probably keep the bridge closed until morning." She hesitated before continuing. "The cottage on Maple Street still does not have electricity. The utility company called earlier." I looked outside at the empty street, then back at the glowing fireplace. "So I cannot get into the house?" "You could," she said with a small smile. "You just would not have heat, lights, or much company." I laughed quietly for the first time in weeks. "That is a persuasive argument." She returned the smile, warm and genuine. "There is a small apartment above the bookstore. It is nothing fancy, but it is warm, and there is fresh linen in the closet. You are welcome to stay until the power comes back. I hesitated only for a second before nodding. Somewhere deep inside me, beneath the grief, the confusion, and the endless questions, another feeling had begun to emerge. For reasons I could not explain, saying yes did not feel like trusting a stranger. It felt like accepting an invitation that had been waiting for me much longer than I had known. The apartment above the bookstore felt nothing like the empty house I had left behind 3 weeks earlier. Instead of echoing with memories I wished I could erase, it welcomed me with quiet simplicity. A braided rug stretched across polished pine floors. A single reading lamp cast a circle of warm light beside an overstuffed chair. Rain tapped gently against the dormer windows while the scent of fresh linen and cedar drifted through the room. Evelyn placed a folded towel on the foot of the bed before stepping toward the doorway. "The bathroom is across the hall," she said. "There is homemade soup downstairs if you get hungry later." I smiled. "You seem to think of everything." She laughed softly. "Not everything." Her eyes lingered on mine for only a moment before she looked away. "Sleep well, Claire." After she closed the door, the room became wonderfully still. I slipped my coat onto the wooden stand beside the window, and the unopened envelope from my mother slid into my hands once again. It had been with me all evening, quietly waiting. I sat in the chair, listening to the rain, tracing the edge of the envelope with my thumb. The urge to open it had become almost impossible to ignore, yet something inside me insisted I should wait a little longer. Instead, I walked to the window. From there I could see the bookstore sign gently swaying in the breeze and the soft glow spilling from the front windows below. Evelyn was moving through the shop, extinguishing lanterns one by one as the electricity finally returned. She paused beside a display table, absent-mindedly straightening a stack of novels before turning toward the fireplace. Even from above, there was something calming about the way she moved. Nothing hurried, nothing forced. She seemed completely present in every small task. I realized I had not felt that way in years. My own life had become an endless list of obligations, compromises, and quiet disappointments. Somewhere along the way I had forgotten what it meant simply to exist without preparing for the next problem. A gentle knock interrupted my thoughts. I opened the door to find Evelyn holding another mug of tea. "I remembered you hardly touched dinner," she said. "Chamomile again?" I asked with a smile. "Unless your preferences have changed in the last 3 hours." I accepted the mug, our fingers brushing lightly for the briefest instant. Neither of us pulled away abruptly. We simply shared a small, almost embarrassed smile before I stepped aside. "Would you like to come in?" I asked. She hesitated. "Only if you are certain you would rather have company than silence." I looked around the unfamiliar room. Earlier that question would have been easy. After my divorce I had hidden from nearly everyone, convinced solitude was safer than disappointment. Tonight the answer surprised even me. "Stay for a little while." Evelyn settled into the chair across from mine, cradling her own mug between both hands. We spoke about ordinary things at first. The bakery on Main Street, the lighthouse overlooking the bay, the annual autumn festival that would begin in a few days if the weather cooperated. Slowly, without noticing exactly when it happened, our conversation shifted toward ourselves. I admitted that I had once dreamed of opening a small art gallery before life became practical instead. She confessed she had almost sold the bookstore after losing her father but changed her mind because she could not bear to imagine someone else locking the front door each evening. There was no performance between us, no careful attempt to appear stronger than we felt. Just 2 women sitting in a quiet room while the rain faded into the distance, discovering that sometimes the safest place to begin telling the truth was with someone who had never asked you to become anyone other than yourself. Morning arrived quietly, carried by the scent of fresh coffee and the distant cry of gulls drifting in from the bay. I woke before the alarm on my phone ever had a chance to ring. For a few peaceful seconds I forgot where I was. Then the slanted ceiling, the soft morning light, and the comforting smell of old books reminded me that I was still above Evelyn's bookstore. I had not slept that deeply in years. The weight that usually settled across my chest each morning had eased, replaced by something unfamiliar. Curiosity. After dressing, I slipped the unopened envelope into my coat pocket and made my way downstairs. The bookstore was already alive. Sunlight streamed through the front windows, turning floating dust into tiny golden sparks. Evelyn stood on a small wooden ladder arranging books on the highest shelf. She looked over as the bell above the staircase chimed. "Good morning," she said with an easy smile. "You look rested." I almost forgot what that feels like. Breakfast is waiting. A small table near the fireplace held warm blueberry muffins, fresh fruit, and 2 steaming mugs. Nothing extravagant. Just simple food shared without expectation. We talked about the weather, the clearing skies, and the bridge reopening later that afternoon. I noticed how naturally conversation flowed between us now. There were no awkward pauses demanding to be filled. Silence simply became another comfortable language. Just as I reached for another sip of tea, the front door opened. A cheerful woman carrying a basket of flowers stepped inside. "Morning, Evelyn," she called before noticing me. Her smile widened instantly. "You must be Claire." I blinked in surprise. "Have we met?" "Not yet." She laughed warmly. "I am Ruth. I own the flower shop next door. Your mother used to help me arrange bouquets every Saturday morning." She held out a bundle of white daisies. "These are for you." I accepted them almost automatically. "Thank you, but everyone keeps talking about my mother as though she only left yesterday." Ruth's expression softened. "Some people never really leave a place. They become part of it." She squeezed my hand gently before disappearing back into the sunshine. I looked toward Evelyn. Did everyone know she was coming here? Evelyn hesitated. Most of the people who were close to her. Then why did nobody ever contact me after she passed away? The question escaped before I could stop it. Evelyn lowered her eyes. "Because she asked us not to." My breath caught. "She what?" Evelyn walked slowly toward an old wooden cabinet near the register. From the top drawer she removed a leather journal tied with a faded blue ribbon. She rested it carefully on the table between us without opening it. "Your mother believed there were things you needed to discover in your own time," she said quietly. "She was afraid that if someone explained everything too soon, you would come here out of obligation instead of choice." I stared at the journal, my pulse quickening. "Everything?" Evelyn nodded almost reluctantly. "There are answers inside these pages." I reached toward the ribbon, but before my fingers touched it, Evelyn gently placed her hand over the cover. Her touch was light, respectful, almost hesitant. "Please," she whispered. "There is one thing you deserve to hear from me before you read a single word she left behind." I looked into her green eyes, suddenly aware that whatever she was about to say had been waiting just as patiently as the letters, the photographs, and the quiet welcome that had greeted me the moment I arrived in Cedar Hollow. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The bookstore seemed to fade around us until all I could hear was the gentle ticking of the old clock above the fireplace. Evelyn kept one hand resting lightly on the leather journal, as though she had protected it for so long that letting go required its own kind of courage. "Before your mother left Cedar Hollow," she said quietly, "she asked me to make her one promise." My heart pounded so loudly I wondered if she could hear it. "What promise?" Evelyn drew a slow breath. "She told me that if life ever became difficult for you, I was never to come looking for you. She believed every person deserves the freedom to choose their own path, even if it leads them far away." I frowned. "Then why keep all of this?" My hand gestured toward the journal, the photograph, and the unopened envelope still resting inside my coat pocket. "Because she also believed that one day, you would need a place where you could remember who you were before. The world convinced you to become someone else." Tears filled my eyes before I realized they were coming. 22 years of trying to be the perfect wife. The careful compromises. The quiet loneliness that had settled into my marriage long before it ended. Somewhere along the way I had stopped recognizing the woman looking back at me in the mirror. Evelyn smiled gently. "She never asked me to shape your future. Only to keep a door open in case you ever wanted to walk through it." I looked down at the journal and finally untied the faded blue ribbon. Inside the first page, written beneath my mother's name, was a single sentence. "If Claire is reading this, then she finally trusted herself enough to come home." I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the impossible kindness hidden inside those words. My mother had never abandoned this place. She had simply believed I would find it when I was ready. I turned several more pages, discovering stories I had never heard, photographs tucked between entries, pressed wildflowers, recipes, little sketches of the bookstore, and dozens of mentions of Evelyn. Not once did my mother describe her as someone carrying an obligation. She called her my dearest friend, my safest harbor, the woman who reminded me that love is often quiet before it is brave. I looked up slowly. You loved my mother. Evelyn smiled with peaceful honesty. Very much. The answer carried no shame, no hesitation, only gratitude. She loved your father deeply too, Evelyn continued. Life is more complicated than people like to admit. We were part of each other's lives in different seasons. What mattered most was that we wanted each other to be happy. Instead of confusion, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. Love, I realized, was larger than the narrow definitions I had carried for years. It could change shape without losing its sincerity. I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over Evelyn's. This time neither of us pulled away. The warmth of her hand felt steady, grounding, familiar in the way only genuine kindness can become. Outside, sunlight filled Main Street. The storm had washed every window clean. Children laughed somewhere near the harbor, and the bells from the small church echoed softly across town. I do not know what happens next, I admitted. Evelyn's eyes met mine with quiet confidence. Neither do I. She smiled. But for the first time we both get to choose. A week later I moved into the cottage on Maple Street, but every morning seemed to begin inside the bookstore with tea, conversation, and shelves filled with stories waiting to be discovered. Sometimes I helped organize community events. Sometimes we simply watched the rain together without feeling the need to explain our silence. Healing did not arrive all at once. It came in ordinary moments shared with someone who never asked me to become anyone except myself. One evening, as we locked the bookstore and stepped into the cool autumn air, I looked at Evelyn, smiled, and held out my hand. She accepted it without surprise, as though hope had simply taken the long way home. In that quiet moment, I finally understood the lesson my mother had left behind. The people meant to change your life do not always arrive when you expect them. Sometimes they patiently keep a light burning, until you are finally ready to find your own way back.